I'm always slightly hesitant whenever you go to speak on Job. Job is such an immense book with such difficult subject matter, and it feels like such little answers. Whenever you go through Job, you kind of always want a little more extra detail. You would want to know more of the mind of God, of why he chose to do what he did. You have that contrast between Satan being the one who asked permission and is granted permission, but Satan really isn't talked about for the entirety of the book. He is the main proponent in chapter 1 and chapter 2 for why these things happen, but all of the fault or all of the credit goes to God throughout the rest of the book. And we would like to know more of why is it stated that way? Why isn't that Satan is not given more credit? Why isn't that a part of the topic? But we're not going to answer any of those questions. We're going to skirt all of those issues and talk about something slightly different. Job is probably one of the oldest stories in the Bible, barring the very first couple chapters of Genesis. But there's good indication that Job would have lived before or about the time of Abraham. And the story would have been recorded or written down later on, but passed along oracally for a long time before it was actually penned, which gives you a good indication of why almost the entire book is in poetic form. It lends itself to being memorized so that it could be related orally. But I want us to give that kind of mindset for Job, that Job would have lived during a time period before even the Old Testament was written. As given by chapter 1, it appears it was before the time period of the covenant with Moses, at least. And how much would have been known about God beforehand? And yet Job speaks a lot about God throughout the chapters. Job, for every chapter that one of his friends speaks, Job usually speaks 2 to 3 chapters per reply. And a lot of what he says seems really founded or really grounded in truth. Job seems to understand God a lot better than most people even today understand him, regarding, without even having the scriptures in front of him. And yet, when you get to chapter 38, the Lord answers. And after Job, with his very limited knowledge base, and expounding upon his understanding of God very eloquently and very well, God's first question is in verse 2. So the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" And it seems like a harsh judgment just to start off with. After all that we understand about Job and how good he seems to argue about God, God's first answer is, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" So what I would like to do today, I would love to spend our time going through God's reply. I want to focus on just 2 verses of God's reply and make a point from those 2 verses. And then I want to skip over to Job's final answer in chapter 42. I want us to pick up on what Job learned. He makes kind of 4 definitive statements here in 42 that I want us to see if we can understand why he made those statements and maybe make some application to our life. But I would like to start there in chapter 38, and I want to go down towards the end in verse 31 and verse 32. So chapter 38 is mostly questions about the universe itself. God says here in verse 3 of chapter 38, "Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me." So as Job and his friends are discoursing about whether or not he is suffering as a direct consequence for sin, or his sins, Job eventually wanders off onto the course of whittling on God's end of the stick, and then demanding that God answer him for all the things that are happening. And God doesn't show up to answer, God shows up to question. So he tells Job, "Dress like a man, present yourself before me, and I will question you." And then most of chapter 38 is given over to the natural laws that God has put into place. And I want us to pick up on a couple of verses in verse 31, verse 32. They are they're ones that always have stood out to me because these are names of things that we still use today. There are ones that we lived out in the country, and so I always like to go out and watch the stars at night. And we had friends who lived in the cities, and whenever anything kind of astrological happened, they would come over and see it because they couldn't see it in Pittsburgh. And so watching the stars and the constellations, staying up late for shooting stars, always was a big pleasure. And seeing that God mentions them to Job by name way back then is really interesting. So he asked these questions in verse 31. Can you bind the chains of Pleiades? And can you loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in its season? Or can you guide Arcturus with its children or his sons? Depending on your translation, it may say the bear, or it may say Arcturus. It may say his children or his sons, given there in verse 32. If you haven't known, Levi's middle name is Orion. Obviously, he is mentioned in the Bible. But he asked these questions: can you bind the chains of Pleiades, or can you loose the cords of Orion? And can you guide the bear or Arcturus with its children? I want us to give a couple seconds to consider what the world knew about the stars back in Job's time. I mean, it wasn't until, the 1400s the first rudimentary telescope was made, and there shortly after the moons of Jupiter discovered. Think about what the world would have known about the stars. Almost nothing. And these seem just like questions, but until you start looking a little bit further into it, God puts a lot more specific detail in these two verses than probably most of human history has ever understood that he put in there. I want to look at this for just a second. For those who like the constellations or know them, this may be old hat information, but if you don't, I'll run you through a little bit. So the Pleiades, sometimes called the Seven Sisters, are what appears to be seven stars that are clustered together. It's one of the unusual clustering of stars in our night sky. We were in South Africa this year, and we had one of our rolling blackouts, or one of the load sheddings at nighttime. And so we had left somebody's house, and we were heading to the car. And I had asked the guys, do you know the constellations? And they said, no, most of the time we live in our villages with the lights on. We don't get to look at the stars very often. I said, well, while the lights are off, let's go ahead and point out the Pleiades. And then I pointed out here in Job chapter 38, that the Pleiades were mentioned by God. And so he said, that's the Pleiades. If you ever are confused about it, that's what we're talking about. But the Pleiades aren't actually seven stars. They are clusters of stars that appear to our eye to be seven. In fact, there's over 250 stars in that cluster. I want to give you a couple quotes by some astronomers. Isabel Lewis, who was the United States naval astronomer, wrote, and she said, astronomers have identified 250 stars that are actually members of this group. And notice what she says: they all share in a common motion and drifting through space in the same direction. So God says, can you bind the Pleiades together? Can you hold them together? And his implication is that he already has. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that they discovered that these stars, all 250 of them, are bound together on the same course. Robert Trumpeller, who also is an astronomer, says over 25,000 individual measures of the Pleiades stars are now available. And their study has led to an important discovery, that the whole cluster is moving southwesterly, and this leaves no doubt that the Pleiades is not temporarily or accidentally aligned, but are bound together. I find people's wordings to be interesting. Individuals who aren't necessarily Christians, who aren't biblical scholars, but just look at what God has put into place, and their wording lines up almost perfectly with Scripture. Remember, how much would Job have known about the stars? Or anybody who has relayed the story of Job or written the story of Job down, how many thousands of years has gone by when they read, can you bind the chains of Pleiades? And they think, oh, that's just a figure of speech. Only for astronomers to say, oh, no. God has literally bound them together And so the same cluster of stars that Job saw thousands of years ago is the exact same cluster that we see today, and it hasn't changed at all. Well, maybe that's just a coincidence. So let's move on to the next phrase in verse 31. Or can you loose the cords of Orion? For those who recognize Orion, there are 2 shoulder stars, there are 3 for the belt, and there are 2 for the legs. He has a couple for the arm and a bow as well as the, I think is it a tiger that he's holding? All that is inside the constellation of Orion. But the one he mentions here, can you loose the cords or can you loose the belt of Orion? And again, I'm going to give you a couple quotes to give you an idea. These are 3 stars that make up his belt: Montauk, Anahalim, and Alnitak. All 3 of those are the 3 names of the stars. And Garrett Severus, who wrote The Curiosity of the Skies, who was an astronomer, says, in the course of time, the 2 right-hand stars, Montauk and Anahalim, will approach each other and form a naked-eye double, but the third, Alnitak, will drift eastwardly so that the belt will no longer exist. And there is some evidence that over the last couple thousand years since Job was talked to, that this constellation has changed some. And if given enough time, the constellation will continue to change to the extent that that belt will no longer exist. So when Job was asked the question, can you loose the chains of Orion or loose the belt of Orion, they were already moving by that point in time. God was already separating them back then. You think, well, maybe again, that's just coincidence. Well, then there's another phrase in verse 32, or can you guide Arcturus with its sons, or the bear with its children? Arcturus is one of the brightest stars in the night sky, and in 1971, astronomers discovered that 52 additional stars are connected directly to it. I love it whenever it takes us until the middle of the 20th century to figure out something that should have been readily apparent from the text. So when he mentions the bear with its children, up until 1971, no one knew that there were children or smaller stars that were connected to Arcturus. I find that just fascinating. So he asked the question, can you guide the bear with its children? Charles Buckhalter of the Cabot Observatory says that these stars are are a law unto themselves, that Arcturus is so large and that it moves so quickly that all the rules of physics seem to not apply to Arcturus. So Garrett Severus, the same person who wrote Curiosities in the Night Sky, says Arcturus is one of the greatest suns in the universe. It is a runaway star whose speed of flight is at 257 miles per second. He says Arcturus, we have every reason to believe, possesses thousands of times the mass of our own sun, which travels only at 12.5 miles per second. This high velocity places Arcturus and a small class of stars that apparently are a law unto themselves. The combined attraction of all the stars that we know could not stop him or even turn him in his path. So that every body in the heavens has a gravitational force. And Garrett Severus's point is that if you were to combine all the stars together to try to use that gravitational force to slow or even to alter the course of Arcturus, you couldn't do it. Now, read again verse 32. Can you guide Arcturus with its sons? Or could you guide the bear with its children? I want us to just pause for a few seconds and just consider the implication of just those 2 verses in Job, where God asked Job a question that it took us until the 1900s BC or AD to even realize that they were questions that actually had meaning rather than just figures of speech. Can you bind the chains of Pleiades, that they are all bound together, all moving in the same direction, that they are chained together? Or can you loose the cords of Orion, where God has already begun to separate them? Or can you guide the bear that all of the rest of the universe combined could not change its course, and yet God set it on its path. That all the laws of physics don't seem to apply to this one star that God made. I find that to be mind-blowing. Now, consider just some of the other questions that you have here. In verse 34, can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that the flood of waters may come over you? Can you send forth lightnings, that they may go and say to you, here we are? Have you put wisdom in the inner parts, or given understanding to the mind? Can you number the clouds by wisdom, or can you tilt the water skins of the heavens? When the dust runs into a mass, or the clods stick fast together. Actually, it was just this morning I was reading an article that asked the question, how heavy is a cloud? What's the weight of a cloud? They hang above us all the time, and yet you never consider them having weight because they're floating. And the average cumulus cloud, as it turns out, weighs about the same as 40 elephants. And the average hurricane weighs about the same as about 1 million elephants. You know, God speaks a lot here in chapter 38 about the clouds and pouring out the water skins of heaven. We see the separation of the waters from the waters in Genesis chapter 1, or the water cycle over in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. The list can go on and on about all that God has put into nature that we didn't even understand how it worked until extremely recently. When Job replies here in chapter 40 and verse 4, and Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not hear, or I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. God then again challenges Job from the whirlwind in verse 6. He tells him in verse 7, dress for action, and I will question you, and you make it known to me. He then begins to talk about the creation inside of the universe that he has made. The animals and how they reproduce, the trees and how tall they are. All of the things that he has put forward. And then Job's reply, his final reply, is there in chapter 42. I want us to read his reply. I want us to see if we can't find some important information when it comes to our own sufferings. Things are unusual at this point in time. Things are hard. There are a lot of people who have suffered physical pain, physical death, emotional pain, pain of separation, pain of loss, pain of normalcy, the loss of kinship and just being around people. Obviously, we're still meeting here under a pavilion and not in our normal location because things are unusual. And at what point in time do we stop just trying to understand, and how many times do we start answering back to God? Needing in our own minds to know why and how long and for what purpose. Job's answer in chapter 40 was, I am of small account, and what shall I answer you? Now let's read his answer in chapter 42, starting in verse 1. Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I do not understand, the things that are too wonderful for me, which I do not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you will make known to me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. The first thing I would suggest, sometimes we need to talk less. Solomon says, as we've been going through on our Wednesday night class, that when there is abundance of word, transgression is not lacking. And what we find with Job is the more that his friends question him, the longer his responses get, until he strays off into a territory that he should not be in. And Job's first answer is that he's going to put his hand over his mouth, that he has spoken and he will not speak again, and he will proceed no further. And then he quotes here in Job 42, he quotes God in verse 3. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? And Job's reply to that is, I have uttered what I do not understand, things that are too wonderful for me, which I do not know. He then quotes God again in verse 4, Hear, and I will speak. And his reply is, And I will question you, and you will make it known to me. It is hard sometimes whenever we suffer, or suffer unjustly, or suffer without understanding why, without seeing a purpose, to be silent. But that's the first lesson that Job learned. It's sometimes to talk less. That's not the only lesson that he learned, but he realized that he has gone too far in what he said. Look there in chapter 42 in verse 2. He says, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Sometimes we need to recognize God's power and his sovereignty. Sometimes we need to step back and just say, You are God. And recognize what that means. Job seems to have forgotten that towards the end of his speeches, that God is sovereign and God has the right and the power and the ability to do whatever he chooses to do. And what God does in his replies, or in his non-reply question format, is to get Job to understand that he is God and that he can do anything, that he can bind the Pleiades, and he can loose the chains of Orion, and he can guide Arcturus. He can do all of those things simultaneously and still have time to take care of us. Sometimes we need to take time to recognize God's power and his sovereignty and the choices that he makes. If you're looking there in verse 3, we need to learn not to whittle on God's end of the stick. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Job answers, Therefore I have uttered what I do not understand, things that are too wonderful for me, which I do not know. And that is really difficult sometimes. As learned as we are in Scripture, as much as we think we understand God's purposes and God's plans in life, to not speak on God's behalf where he has not spoken can be very difficult. And we look at what Job says and we think, well, what he says seems to be pretty reasonable. And he seems to have a pretty good squared away understanding of God, especially better than his three friends. And yet he erred in speaking too much on God's behalf. And that's important for us to understand that our job is not to speak on God's behalf. There in verse 5, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Now we know that no one has actually seen God, the Father. That point is made very clear throughout Scripture. Of the time of Elijah, who wanted to just be taken by God, to be just no longer exist maybe, or just die. God would not allow him to see him, but allowed to see him just the backside of him. Moses would go and talk face to face, but not actually see him face to face. And so the phrasing here in Job 42 and verse 5 doesn't mean that Job actually saw God face to face, because God made the point that no man can see me and live. So it must mean something else. I would suggest to you that it means that he recognizes God. We have heard of God All of our lives we have heard of God. We have gone to Bible classes, we've gone to Sunday school, we've gone to summer camps, we have sat under boring people and listened to them talk about God. But there's a difference between hearing about God and seeing Him in His work and His creation. I think true wonder can come about whenever we get to see God in every aspect of life. And Job is beginning to recognize that. That I have heard of you by the hearing of the ears, but now my eyes see you. And therefore I despise myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. Sometimes we need to see God for who He is. And all of those things are extremely difficult lessons to learn inside of hardship. I mean, the book of Job is not an easy book, and I don't intend to imply that I have all the answers for all that happened to Job, but I want to look at the things that he said that he's learned through this process. Losing his family and losing his wealth and losing his health, and then having to argue with his 3 friends over whether or not God is directly punishing him for a sin that he's currently hiding in his life. And then having God answer him out of a whirlwind. What a terrifying and awesome experience that must be, to put Job back in his place. And the first thing he says is that he is going to stay silent. As hard as it is to suffer, or to suffer unjustly, as hard as it is to not have answers for why we're going what we're going through, Job says, I am of small account. What shall I answer back to God? Paul phrases it this way in Romans chapter 9. Can what is molded answer back to the molder? Why have you made me this way? Sometimes there is no answer. And sometimes the best answer is to not answer at all. Job next states in verse 2 of chapter 42 that I know that you can do all things. There is an absolute statement of faith that God has the ability, that God has the right, and that God can have all of His purposes not thwarted. We know what happens towards the later end of chapter 42, that Job's fortunes are restored twofold, that God truly can do anything. Whenever we're going through hardship, do we have that absolute faith that God can do anything? Romans chapter 8 has been one that's been on my mind a lot the last couple months, that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. And there's been a lot of good in the last couple months. There's been a lot of hardship, a lot of hurt. There has been a loss of property and jobs. There has been difficulties for sure. And I don't want to discount any of those things. But all things work together for good for those who love God. And Job states that I know, God, that you can do all things. Whenever we face hardships, do we have that absolute unwavering faith that God can do all things, including work good out of terrible situations? Do we recognize God's power and His sovereignty? His point there in verse 42 in verse 3, or verse 2. Do we whittle on God's end of the stick? Where Job says, I have uttered what I do not understand, things that are too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Well, if we do, then we need to stop. And that's one of the main lessons that Job learned. And do we recognize God and His handiwork? Where Job says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Sometimes it is through the hardest of situations that we begin to see God working most powerfully. And sometimes that's a hard thing to really accept. In the good times, sometimes we don't even take time to notice God working. When things are going well, sometimes we don't see it as prevalent, but sometimes in the hard times, we can recognize God the clearest. So I just want to leave you with those 4 ideas that Job learned. Sometimes to hold his tongue, to recognize God's power and his sovereignty and have faith in those things, to not whittle on God's end of the stick and claim things for God or about God that God hasn't stated for himself, and then to see him in his actions, to recognize him, not just to hear of God, but to see his work in our lives. I can't tell you the number of times in the last couple of years that I've seen people who did not fully understand or appreciate or even fully believe in God's providence, who have started to say, I see God's providence in this situation or that situation, and almost every time it was a negative thing. From an outside perspective, you think, oh, that's a negative situation, and yet in their mind, they say, I see God's providence in this. God is really working in this area. And it took the hardship for them to see God, to take it from the hearing of the ear to the seeing of the eye. I don't have all the answers, obviously, for all the things that are going on. But I want to look at Job's response and ask us to learn the things that he learned without having to lose all the things that he had to lose. To learn from his mistakes so that we don't have to go through them ourselves. I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope that you guys take some time this week and to really consider what Job's answer is in these 6 short verses as a summary of the entire book. I hope that you're looking at the stars maybe tonight or sometime in the course of this week, you recognize that God is exactly who he is. That his powers are unmitigated and daunting, and they are absolutely able to accomplish his purposes. And I hope that you walk away looking at Job's story with absolute faith and confidence in who God is. The Song of Invitation is number 298.